In episode 44 of Mobycast, we discuss AWS's launch of DocumentDB and whether or not Mongo should be worried. Welcome to Mobycast, a weekly conversation about containerization, Docker, and modern software deployment. Let's jump right in.
Welcome, Chris. It's another episode of Mobycast.
Hey, John. Good to be back.
Yep, and you'll notice that I didn't mention Rich. He's not with us today, and it's because we just recorded one with him yesterday, and we're doing another one today because of this timely thing that's come up. So the one that we recorded yesterday, those of you listening, you'll hear it next week, because this week we're going to be talking about AWS DocumentDB. Our decision to do this was, it was like, oh, this is so interesting, and we started having a conversation about it, and 2 minutes into the conversation, we were like, we should do this as a Mobycast. And then we were like, let's do it tomorrow. So here we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was kind of like, okay, stop talking about this. We got to wait till we're on tape.
Right.
Save it for the tape.
So AWS launched DocumentDB with Mongo compatibility this week, announced January 9th, 2019. And what was your reaction when you saw that, Chris?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction was definitely not a surprise. And the rumor mill has been speculating that this was going to happen for months now. And, it makes a lot of sense just given, what AWS is really strong in. I mean, obviously they're really strong in knowing how to run and operationalize distributed systems. They've done this for many open source packages, like things like Redis and Memcached and recently Kafka. MongoDB is a very, very popular document database. It's basically the grandfather of them all for the most part. And as far as like a commercial marketplace goes. So very popular, lots of folks are using it, but if you're running inside AWS, it's all on your own, right? You have to do the management of it. So that's why we have DocumentDB. AWS looks across the landscape, see that they have quite a few of their customers that are using MongoDB, but they have these problems, right? They're struggling with, how do they get the performance availability out of it that they require? How do they, just the management of it, right? Like that is stuff that customers don't want to have to do. It really doesn't, it's not a core differentiator for them. It's the undifferentiated heavy lifting.
We have personal experience with this at Kelsis, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we are users of MongoDB ourselves. And we know very, very much the real pain that goes along with managing that. So we have MongoDB in multiple environments, and each one of those environments, depending on its availability requirements, there's clusters of MongoDB. And so we have to deal with like having replica sets, and how do we do backups? And more importantly, how do we do restores when we need to? We have to test and verify that failover works the way that we expect it to, and that applications respond accordingly. We have to continually do software updates and make sure that our agents are current and up to date. And then also it's somewhat of a task for us to go upgrade Mongo versions as well when they're out. So there's a lot of overhead and maintenance that comes along with our MongoDB
Can
nodes.
you give me just a little more specificity around our setup? Like, aren't we using it? Are we installing it directly on bare metal EC2s, or that's not the right term, but just directly onto EC2 instances?
Yeah, I mean, bare metal EC2 instances is a thing. We're not
I
using
know, that's
those.
why I caught myself.
Yeah, we're using standard, but we are using standard EC2 instances, so VMs. And we are directly installing MongoDB on those. And so for our replica sets, they're 3-node clusters. So that means, 3 EC2s that we've spun up. And on each one of those, we've manually installed the MongoDB software. We do use Mongo's monitoring service to kind of help us manage these nodes. So that's MMS. And so there's an agent that gets installed on each one of those nodes that we have to set up the communication path from our AWS data center out over the internet to MMS, so it can see those nodes. And then from a MMS console, we can do things like,
oh, that's so weird,
initiate backups. And
MMS lives outside the AWS. We have to basically put a hole in the firewall for it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely. So there has to be some way for MMS to connect to it. So, whether that's now private versus public or firewalls or some way of providing that connectivity. But MMS is run by Mongo, and so it's absolutely not inside of VPC, and there's no like VPC endpoints for anything like that. So,
well, I guess what's weird to me is that MongoDB, they're like, here's the binary, go install it wherever you want. But MMS, no, we're keeping that, we're managing that. That's just weird to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes with the evolution of Mongo.
Okay.
I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more as we get into this podcast. But
right, I know I'm kind of cutting away from the outline a little bit, but what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to get a sense of what we do today and why we do what we do, because I think understanding that from our real perspective of owning and operating a Mongo cluster or multiple Mongo clusters will help you, dear listener, like understand how powerful this new thing from AWS could potentially be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, going back to your original question, like what was my reaction to the announcement? Another way of saying that was like I was extremely ecstatic, right? Like I immediately like started putting together the notes, and I actually put it on our work item, our work management system, right? I mean, there were pivotal cards created just for this. Like, let's go ahead and start testing this out, right? Like, how fast can we get off of our dedicated MongoDB onto DocumentDB, just so that we don't have to manage it, and I don't have to worry about like is restore going to work? Like, are the backup jobs running correctly? Like, what is the level of granularity? We'll get into all this as we kind of like talk through some of the features.
Before we push forward into the features, though, I still have one more kind of burning question about how we ended up where we are today with multiple clusters of Mongo that we're managing ourselves inside AWS. So that last question is, I know there's managed Mongo services out there, and I think Mongo itself even offers one. So why are we doing it ourselves? Why DIY when those other options probably did exist for us?
So yeah, I mean, managed Mongo does indeed exist, and we'll dive deeper into this too as we go on, because it really is kind of sheds an interesting dynamic into the tension between the companies. But why we're not using it today, probably like two main reasons. One is the fact that this decision to use Mongo was quite a while back, right? It's over 2 years ago is when we started using it. So Atlas didn't exist at that time, which is MongoDB's managed service. There were other things like Mongo HQ.
MLab is another one. Yep.
And this leads to maybe the second reason why we don't do it is that those are all outside of AWS. So you basically have to go out over the open internet, right? Yep. From your servers inside the VPC, your application servers that need that data. They're going out over the open internet for that. So there's a very real performance and dependency issue.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, you can mitigate the security with things like, just being smart about like firewalls and encryption and things like that. But it's one more hurdle. So to actually have the data co-located inside our own VPC it's definitely an advantage.
Cool. So there was no Atlas, and we want to stay inside AWS. Perfectly. And anybody making that argument to me, it's like, yep. All right, let's do it. Let's fire up our own Mongos on EC2s. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move forward into this new world.
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, DocumentDB was recently announced. I mean, it is fresh, hot off the presses, January 9th. And what is it? So it's a drop-in replacement for MongoDB. This is really interesting, right? Yeah. So they're not hosting MongoDB, right? Instead, it's wire level protocol compatible with MongoDB. So they specifically say they're emulating the responses that a MongoDB client would expect from a MongoDB server. So it's impersonation. Right. And so they look at the MongoDB API, and that's what they implemented. They implemented the Mongo API. So I think it's kind of important just to remember, like, this is not hosted Mongo at all. There's no, as far as I know, I mean, there's really probably no Mongo code.
Right. It's like when Kramer on Seinfeld decided that he could be the movie phone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's kind of what this is, right? Like this is like, okay, what's the API? And we will just go and craft our own implementation of that mimics that and performs that API. So that's how they have built it and delivered it. And so along with that, it is a managed service offered by AWS, and all the kind of great aspects that you would expect from a managed service from AWS applies here. So in areas of scalability, reliability, security, like all the check marks are here. So what's kind of interesting is that they did, when they announced this, they talked about how the storage layer for this is it's SSD based with 6x replication across 3 separate AZ zones,
So
availability
good.
zones, right? So this to me sounds like this is the exact same storage platform as what like Aurora uses.
Yep.
And I wouldn't be surprised actually if like it's kind of they've done some and DynamoDB might be doing the same thing as well. Although with DynamoDB they definitely talk about like the 3x replication, not necessarily the 6x. So maybe but definitely the Aurora storage platform. Like it sounds like this is the exact same storage, that same technology. They're using it here for DocumentDB, which, and this might be a good time to talk about this as an aside. And there's been just rumors and ponderings on like, well, how do they go implement that? How do they implement this? And I know that you were looking on a Reddit thread, and someone was suggesting that their vote was that this is Postgres. They implemented this on top of PostgreSQL, and I think this is another hint in that puzzle, right? So it's probably the Aurora Postgres flavor, right? Is how they've implemented it.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that thread now, and it's there were little signatures to that people were pointing out to give it even more credibility. Like identifiers are limited to 63 characters.
Mm-hmm.
The same characters that PostgreSQL limits identifiers to, and a collection size limit of 32 terabytes, coincidentally, which is the maximum PostgreSQL table size. So, yeah.
So think about like how cool that is, about how much existing technology they probably leveraged for this.
Oh, I know. It's just
right.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like this is a pretty major new managed service that they're offering, and
somebody like some team of like pizza sized team did it in like a weekend.
Well, maybe not a weekend, but yeah, I mean, it was probably, they were probably extremely efficient with this, right? Which is pretty interesting and pretty cool, because I think a lot of these features they got for free, right? So we talked, so the reliability, it's designed for 99.99% availability, so 4 nines availability. We've talked about the storage layer with the 6x replication across 3 AZs. Database can scale from 10 gigabytes all the way up to 64 terabytes in size. You can have up to 15 read replicas. So you can scale out quite to support just a tremendous amount of read traffic in these clusters.
Do you know how much read traffic a single instance can handle? Like, it sounds like you could basically put whatever you want on this.
Yeah, it's up to you. I mean, they offer this. I think it's you get your choice of 6 different instance sizes, ranging from, and these are the database optimized instance families, I believe, and it goes from, the instances have starting at 15 gigabytes of RAM up to 488 gigabytes of RAM, right? So, I mean, I think it would be really hard to find a situation where this is not going to work for you from a performance standpoint, right?
Like, yeah, if you got it to work on Mongo, then you can get it to work in DocumentDB, it feels like. If not, even more.
Yeah. So massive scalability, the backup story here is awesome. They're offering point-in-time restores with second level resolution, right? To any point within the last 35 days.
Whoa.
Right? Which is awesome, right? And this is exactly what they have in DynamoDB now. And I'm pretty sure this is the same thing in Aurora as well, right? So again, this really kind of goes back to, this is not so much like DocumentDB doing this, it's the underlying core technology that they're leveraging, that they just kind of get this for free.
Right.
So pretty impressive there. And then security-wise, great security story with, authentication is supported. And you also have encryption both in transit as well as encryption at rest. And so these are just easy checkboxes to do when you go and spin up your DocumentDB cluster.
AWS gets some flack, and I think they deserve it for not having those checked by default, like where you'd have to uncheck them. I think they should change. They should change that.
Yeah, I think the default now, encryption in transit is by default with DocumentDB, and encryption at rest may not be by default, but it's just right there in your face, easy enough just to check it. So unlike with DynamoDB encryption at rest is now the default, and it actually just happens for everything that's hosted there now. It's not just new projects. It's right.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So just a really impressive new product drop-in replacement for MongoDB. And we've kind of talked about like, well, why did AWS do this? And it's really, they're just listening to their customers. They're giving them what they want. They see the broad use of MongoDB on AWS. It is a lot of pain and hassle to manage and run those databases. And so hand that work over to AWS and let them do the management. And that's exactly what this is.
Yeah, and the fact that it's not Mongo, you would worry that maybe it's not as stable, or maybe it's like got some barnacles on it that aren't so good that need to be smoothed off, or like, maybe there's some concerns, right? But there's enough evidence that it's built on top of production quality, highly already used and burned in stuff, that the only parts that may be subject to a little bit of like flakiness is just kind of the API, just the interface.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's where the code is, right? And that's where the bumps and the warts are going to be.
Your data is going to be fine. It's just making sure that it'll work for you in your situation.
Yeah. It really just comes down to the fidelity of the API implementation. Like, does it do exactly what MongoDB is doing, and also what is the level of coverage that you have? So they don't have 100% coverage right out of the gate, right? Not every single API is implemented, and they probably looked at like what's the 99th percentile, or then it's probably like maybe there's, I don't know, like say 300 API calls in general, and it's like maybe 80 of those represent like 99% of the usage. And
right.
So that's what they focused on out of the gate. But they do say that they're, obviously they have the telemetry. They can see what calls clients are making against the platform. And for those things that aren't supported, they can track that stuff, and they can use that directly as feedback into, okay, these are the most popular calls that we haven't supported. Let's go and implement it.
Yeah. I'm also thinking that even though the API might be the same, there's just things about how databases work that could be a little bit, they could cause some trouble. So, MongoDB, I believe, is largely, people do a lot of eventually consistent type programming with it. So they expect things not to be there right away if there's some replicas, correct?
Yeah, I mean, so we kind of talked about this with DynamoDB. Same thing with MongoDB. So if you want eventually consistent, is kind of like the default. If you want strongly consistent, you can do that, but you're going to pay a price.
Right. So I'm imagining that some systems, that especially anything that was created with like leaning heavily on magic timeouts, might break when you switch out for DocumentDB. Like those magic timeouts might not be the right length anymore. Stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there could very well, like, the performance,
it could be faster, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so that can cause some problems. You also may have actually like scaffolding code around like failovers. Like there may be some extra stuff that you had to do yourself in your code to deal with like just failover cases, and now you wouldn't need that anymore. So there could be some code that you have to update in order to do the drop in. Yeah, or perhaps even remove. Yeah.
That'd be nice if you can remove some code.
Yes.
Cool. So where are we here?
Yeah. So with that, maybe we could talk a little bit go into like just more about like, okay, what does this mean? What's Mongo's position in this, and what are they doing in this space and whatnot. So, we've hinted at it. Like MongoDB does have a hosted service for the MongoDB database. It's called Atlas, and this is actually pretty important to Mongo. Right, it's something that they say it's growing 300% annually.
I'm not surprised, right? Like it's the query, right? It's like I'm using MongoDB. How do I have that managed?
Yeah.
Like, what's my managed solution? Oh, look, Atlas. Cool. Okay, I like that.
Yeah. So it's this last fiscal quarter, they reported it accounted for 22% of their revenue. So that's huge, right? That's almost a quarter of their revenue is coming from Atlas. So this is a big important piece of their business.
And it's so unsurprising. Did you read the thing, or were we talking about this thing the other day where I was reading something or watching something that talked about open source code and just sort of where it's come from and the big tech companies' attitudes towards it. And essentially the thing was saying big tech companies have realized that their competitive advantage is not the source code. It's their ability to operate it at massive scale. And once you can do that, you have like a moat around your company that's pretty unovercomable. And so, yeah, that fact, I think I believe that. Like if you think about like the big tech giants, one of the things that everybody just consistently says about them is like, oh, well, Google stuff, like they know things that nobody knows because they know how to run 1 million computers at once or 100 million computers at once. Same with AWS. And it's not surprising that Mongo was seeing their ability to do that at scale become the engine of their growth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's there has been this undercurrent of tension between the open source community and then the folks that are using that technology, specifically like the cloud companies like Google's and Amazon and Microsoft's of the world. So there's been this tension where, it feels like these cloud companies, they're increasingly relying on open source software to add new features, right, to their offerings, but they're not really contributing back to the projects, right? So it's kind of like it's just taking and not giving. They're just taking and not giving, right? Yeah. And you'll hear this referred to as strip mining, where these cloud companies are basically just coming in and just leveraging that work that was done by these other groups to build their businesses, right, and to give them new features and whatnot. And like you said, and again, it ends up being like when you're in the cloud and you have to run applications and code and infrastructure, it's not the procurement of the software that's the hard part, or even sometimes even the developing of the software. It's really the operationalizing it, right? The running of it, right?
Yeah, just think about hiring people that can do that can rack and stack machines all day, and that can think about like where there's going to be how to deal with little micro outages that happen across systems of 1 million computers. Like those are super highly specialized people, and you don't just they're not just easy to hire, so they tend to get sucked into one company, and then that company just keeps them forever, and they have like a huge advantage having those people, having that skill, having that context all in-house. And that is, that's, in my mind, that's harder than developing software for sure. Like that problem is a harder business problem.
Yeah. It's very much just reality. I mean, you take your average engineering team, say like, hey, can you go write an application that leverages Kafka and uses the Kafka API to implement some event-driven stream or whatnot, part of your application, and any engineering team will be able to go and do that, right, and implement that. But to now actually run that as a service, to set it up correctly, to have your Kafka clusters and to have monitoring on it, to be able to handle failures and be able to just have alarms and monitoring and everything else that goes along with it. Like that's the hard part, right?
Yep.
And it's also, again, it's this undifferentiated heavy lifting. Like your customers don't care that you're really good at managing Kafka, right?
Right.
So like why spend a whole bunch of time on that? And that's why these, cloud companies are, so attractive, right? Because it allows you to not have to focus on those things that you really shouldn't be spending time on, and you focus on what makes you different, like what is your core competency, and have you focus on that.
Right, and for the cloud companies, it literally is differentiated heavy lifting. It is their core, competency.
Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, so maybe this is a good time then to talk about like what happened back in October that was kind of definitely related to this whole undercurrent of tension of cloud companies kind of like being accused of basically ripping off open source software, right? And so what MongoDB did is they came out with a new license, and they announced this in October 2018, and it would be effective with the Mongo 4.0 release. It's called the server-side public license. It's the SSPL. And the intent behind this was basically it says it kind of forces, like, if anyone offers this as a cloud service, as a managed service, then any code that they write to help enable that as a managed service, that has to be published as open source itself.
Okay.
Right. So any kind of value added software they put on top of Mongo in order to run it as a service, that's now open source.
It sounds like TPL just with the additional, server type of thing added.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this was, definitely, MongoDB's take on like trying to protect themselves, right? Like they're trying to protect Atlas, right? Mm-hmm. They would much prefer to kind of like be the de facto, like ideally probably like the only one out there. Like if you need managed Mongo, you go to Atlas, right? So, I think that was definitely one of the motivations here. And by having this, it definitely makes it harder, right, for folks to do stuff without giving back. And so this is one of the reasons, probably one of the big reasons why DocumentDB is supporting MongoDB 3.6. And not 4.0, because 3.6 is not covered by this new license. It's only 4.0 and afterwards. So by mimicking MongoDB 3.6, it appears that SSPL does not apply to DocumentDB right now. Of course, this means like big questions like, okay, well, what happens going forward?
Right.
Like, DocumentDB going to be stuck on Mongo 3.6 forever? That's an open question. I mean, who knows what's going to happen there? If they want to go to, beyond that, it's either going to be a legal battle where their position may be like, they may say like, well, we're not using the software, right? We're mimicking the API. And so because of that, we're not subject to the SSPL.
Right. And right? I mean, if you just do the thought experiment too of like, well, what can Mongo do, right? Like, what can they do as they add to their product that would cause people to not want to use, I'm essentially thinking like version 4, version 4.1, version 4.2, version 5, like they're going to add features and maybe people want those features, but golly, who's better at adding features to software than AWS? Like nobody is. Mm-hmm. So I can't imagine AWS not being able to kind of keep up with via DocumentDB, like keep up with so if they can start to get people over at the 3.6 level, they're going to hang on to those people for sure. And then like if it becomes an arms race of features, they're going to win it.
It'll be interesting to see if they do become basically a fork, right? And, if that happens, there's going to be a lot of backlash. That would be a pretty big bridge for them to cross, I think, for them to say, you know what, we're going to start innovating here. We're going to start, adding new features that are not part of MongoDB. It's just the stuff that we hear customers asking for. And so now DocumentDB becomes no longer, 100% MongoDB compliant. That's just part of it. And then it extends it, right? And it becomes something new and something different.
I think a superset would be okay, but it's like becoming incompatible with 3.6 then would be kind of a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure it would if it's not compatible.
Yeah.
But I mean, then you start getting into the realm of, well, why not just get people onto Dynamo, right?
Yeah.
That's the core platform there. So if you're going to do any kind of innovation, like, doesn't it make sense just to do that innovation on DynamoDB instead of DocumentDB?
Honestly, legacy is like AWS knows to meet their customers where they are, and their legacy is where the money is getting created for companies. It's making money or it's dying. So that's why legacy exists. So yeah, they're just going to the legacy, trying to pull it over, because I think that they did a great job in 2018 of making everybody aware of DynamoDB and then convincing people that, whoa, DynamoDB is pretty hot shit. So now new startups are like, oh, we want to stay inside AWS world totally, and they maybe don't even sniff around Mongo anymore. So AWS kind of, for blue sky development, AWS is kind of starting to win that, I would guess. And so now they're like, all right, let's pull in the legacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely where they're at right now, and for the the near future, again, it's going to be like, where do they go from here? Like, are they able to support like MongoDB 4.0 API, or are they kind of stuck on 3.6 and it's up to them to
Right.
Where do you go from there? But I mean, I can definitely see them kind of like saying this is the stake in the ground for getting people to make it easier for people that are on Mongo, and we support through 3.6, and then we're going to provide paths for people that need more features and want to continue innovating for migrating you to DynamoDB. They have database migration service, and like this is one of those things it's a really easy migration to make. Other than, I mean, you do have the front end coding, your clients and updating them, but we'll see how it plays out and where this goes from here. It's definitely early days, and we can probably spend many days kind of like theorizing and guessing like what's going to happen.
There was one thing that we talked about that we didn't bring up today that I just want to maybe close with, which is we know for sure that the people that run AWS and the people that run Mongo run in the same circles. They go to the same conferences. They have business meetings together. They know each other. So they have to have talked. And you just know that that's taken place. And so it's like, what happened there? Like, did those business meetings start to fall apart? Is that the reason that AWS didn't just, work with Mongo to bring their own version of a managed service in-house that used real Mongo? Like, what? I guess it's got to be because of Atlas. It's got to be because Mongo's like, no, we got to protect this Atlas thing. And so we just can't let you do that. I can only imagine.
I mean, for me personally, I just don't see any way for them to have a win-win scenario of partnering up, right? Yeah. Like, this is hosted Mongo is such a huge strategic part of their business model for MongoDB. So for them to actually like make that transition into AWS and do some sort of revenue sharing just I don't see how that's too terribly appealing to Mongo. And then also for Amazon, like, they don't have any other kind of relationships like that. Why would they? I mean, for the most part, AWS it's still a margin-based business, right? And like if you have to go pay licenses or do a rev split, like that's going to cut in significantly into your profitability model. So
right, and they could have run I could be wrong here, but I think like at least some level of Mongo up to 3.6 is fully open source. So they could have just been like, well, we're going to do it. We're just doing it. Mm-hmm. But the decision to not do that must have to do with that thing we've talked about already, the 4.0 like difference in license. That it's like, if you're going to handcuff us on 4.0, we're going to create a way where we're not beholden to your new license scheme. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think like whenever AWS did start looking at like hosting Mongo, I'm sure one of the things they looked at was just like, well, what would it take for us to operationalize this and to do things that we, our customers have come to expect with, point in time restore and automatic failover and whatnot. And I'm sure they kind of looked at it and said, you know what, like we really want to leverage our core technology that we have, and that'd be a much better way for us to get there than it would be just to host it as it is, right? Yeah. So I'm sure like this path to go down, the mimicking the API strategy, that was set well before the SSPL was announced, right? That was their
It had to have been, huh? It had to have been.
So, absolutely it was, right? Yeah. So
there's no way they developed all that. I mean, I'm sure it was fast, but it wasn't
not that fast.
Months. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting to note too. I mean, there's very strong rumors and basically, people that are familiar with what happened, that they do say that AWS was very, very much planning to announce DocumentDB at reInvent. But it was in mid-October when this SSPL was announced, and that threw enough, confusion into it where they said, no, they couldn't launch then. I would not be surprised if what they had at that point was MongoDB 4.0 emulation. And what they had to do over the last 6 weeks is scrub that out and bring it back down to 3.6. Like, I bet you that was what happened over the last 6 weeks.
Wow, that would be wild.
Yeah. Anyone from AWS that may be listening, if you want to send a random anonymous message to either confirm or deny. That would be great.
Yep.
And it is kind of interesting too to hear like some of the responses from MongoDB once DocumentDB was announced by AWS. So here's a quote from the CEO of MongoDB. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. His quote was, "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So it's not surprising that Amazon would try to capitalize on the popularity and momentum of MongoDB. However, developers are savvy enough to distinguish between the real thing and a poor imitation." So that to me, like, I'm sorry, that's a pretty weak response just to say, hey, this is just we're the real thing, and anyone else is obviously not good because it's not us. And it's like, but the reality is like, well, actually, it probably is really pretty good, right? And it is something to be very, very worried about. So I think this caught them back on their heels a little bit, although they had to have known it was coming. But I think it just doesn't feel like they thought it through. Like, what's the position?
I think they probably should have focused on like, we're going to do our best to create the best possible database that we can, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Instead of getting, digging in on the competitive front. But yeah, I mean, AWS is eating the world, and I kind of love it and kind of worry about it at the same time. Like, that's a whole other philosophical argument or conversation that we could have. But maybe we could leave it with Snowflake. They're coming for you next.
Yes. Yeah. Go public. While you have the chance.
Well, right on. Thank you so much for that conversation, Chris. That was super fun.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, John.
Well, dear listener, you made it to the end. We appreciate your time and invite you to continue the conversation with us online. This episode, along with show notes and other valuable resources, is available at mobycast.fm/44. If you have any questions or additional insights, we encourage you to leave us a comment there. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.